My name is Cleo, and I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Interaccess. I'm thrilled to welcome all of you here today. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which Interaccess operates has been the site of human activity for 15,000 years. The land we are working on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This acknowledgement is a small step in the larger necessary movement towards decolonization in light of centuries of state-led violence against Indigenous communities across Turtle Island. I would also like to address the ongoing violence against Black communities and to affirm that Black lives matter. On Saturday, 3 peaceful protesters were arrested during a Black Lives Matter action in Toronto. As an arts organization, we value people over monuments, and we stand in solidarity with those protesters. You can follow Black Lives Matter Toronto on Facebook for updates and call to action. It is essential that we as individuals, professionals, and organizations stand up against individual acts of racial violence and that we take concrete actions to dismantle systemic racism. As Interaccess undertakes this work as an organization, we also ask the non-Black members of our community to engage in anti-racist self-education work. We have compiled some educational resources and donation links, which you can find at interaccess.org or at the link tree in our Instagram bio. Thank you for joining us today for the panel Anti-Racist Artist Networks, Emerging Forms of Community, Solidarity, and Care, featuring the artists Ashley Jane Lewis, Fallon Simard, Geneviève Wallen, Syrus Marcus Ware, and moderated by Belinda Kwan. We're really thrilled to have all of you here today. This event is part of Vector Festival 2020 online edition. I invite you to check out the website 2020.vectorfestival.org for the full programming and follow along with us on social media with the hashtag #VectorFestival. There are a few upcoming events that I would like to flag quickly before we begin. Tonight is the online workshop, A Queer Guide to Gift Making with Alex Jensen, starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are still spots available. You can register through our website. Tomorrow at 3 Eastern Time, we will be hosting a panel on working with Indigenous culture in the digital realm, which will feature a discussion between Megan Byrne, Elijah Forbes, and Taylor MacArthur. I hope you can join us for this important conversation. I also encourage you to check out the page for COVID Fashion. It's a performance event that will close the festival on Thursday evening. There's a call for participants that's live on the page. We're inviting you to create and share your creation at the closing event and then join us for a virtual dance party. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Belinda Kwan, who will be moderating this panel and introducing you to our speakers. Belinda Kwan is a Chinese-Canadian settler curator interested in exhibitionary forms of critique, pedagogy, and advocacy. She's a core director at Bunker 2 and a board member of Trinity Square Video. Thank you so much again for being here once again. And Belinda, you can take it from here.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. It's my pleasure to be a part of this with panelists who have been and continue to be doing incredibly important care and justice work. Ashley Jane Lewis is a new media artist with a focus on speculative design and tech education. Her artistic practice explores the Black diaspora of the past, present, future through computational and analog mediums, including science fiction, networked devices, machine learning, data weaving, food design, bioart, and performance. Her award-winning work has exhibited in both Canada and the US, most notably on the White House website during the Obama presidency. As an educator, Ashley has taught more than 3,500 young people how to code, landing her on the 2016 Top 100 Black Women to Watch in Canada, as well as earning her press coverage as a tech activist from outlets like Reader's Digest, Huffington Post, and Metro News. She's proud of the work she's done with Dan Schiffman and ML5.org, a platform offering friendly machine learning for the web in order to lower barriers to entry into creative computing. Ashley holds a BFA in New Media from Ryerson University in Toronto and just completed a master's degree in interactive telecommunications at ITP in New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Fallon Simard's memes and videos capture the conflicts created by colonialism, land, politics, and capitalism. The Anishinaabe artist, Métis artist, creates moving and still images as an embodied and visceral response to Indigenous identity that dispels current tropes of indigeneity. Simard's work instead investigates intensity and burden as products of injustices, human rights violations, and colonial violence. In his videos and memes, Simard illustrates bad feelings and harms from different Indigenous contexts to reveal new modes and effects of colonial, capital, racial policy. Simard's work mobilizes grief, intensity, and trauma as mitigation tools to colonial capital policy. Fallon Simard additionally creates policy recommendations into legislation, services, programs, and organizations to advocate for the human rights and substantive quality of Two-Spirit, queer, and trans Indigenous people. Geneviève Wallen is a Geographies Montreal-based independent curator and writer. She obtained a BFA in art history at Concordia University in 2012 and an MFA in criticism and curatorial practice at OCAD University in 2015. Wallen's practice is informed by diasporic narratives, intersectional feminism, intergenerational dialogues, BIPOC alternative futurities, and healing platforms. Her ongoing research focuses on the notion of longevity as a methodology for resistance and care work in the arts. Her most recent curated exhibition, Made of Honey, Gold, and Marigold, 2020, was on view at the Robert McLaughlin Gallery in Oshawa. Wallen contributed essays for a C magazine and the anthology Other Places, Reflections on New Media Arts in Canada, edited by Deanna Bowen. She's an exhibition coordinator at FOFA Gallery, a member of YTV, Younger Than Beyonce Collective, and is the co-initiator with Marsha Marani of Souped Up, a thematic dinner series conceived to carve spaces for care and support building among BIPOC curators and cultural workers. Syrus Marcus Ware is a Banyan scholar, visual artist, activist, curator, and educator. Cyrus uses painting, installation, and performance to explore social justice frameworks and Black activist culture, and he's shown widely in galleries and festivals across Canada. He's part of the Performance Disability Art Collective and a core team member of Black Lives Matter Toronto. He has won several recognitions, including the TD Diversity Award 2017, Best Queer Activist, Now Magazine 2005, and the Steinert and Ferrero Award 2012. Today, we've come together not only to discuss anti-racism and emergent care networks in the arts, but to think about how they connect to liberation work more holistically in space and time. When presented with the panel topic by the festival and asked to be the moderator, it was important to me that the panel properly addresses the popularization of care as a theoretical framework in recent years, as well as the notion of the emerging, as it's often been used in the professionalization of arts and culture. I want to acknowledge that what appears to be emerging or unprecedented often comes from deep histories of organized resilience and violence. The so-called merits of capitalist innovation and their freshly marketed narratives are built on the backs of racialized, poor, queer, trans, two-spirited, mad, and crip folks through various timelines. These folks have been caregiving, organizing, sharing far before care became a hot cultural topic. So what's simply a temporary academic or cultural exercise for one is for others stored in the body and psyche in the long term. The latter is remarkable in its own right, but in a way that surpasses the language and objects of the PR and marketing world. It's voluntarily washing your depressed friend's dishes. It's noticing when somebody isn't drinking enough water in a day. It's resourcing an impromptu protest in a way a curator might rush to problem solve a last minute high stakes exhibition mishap. It's channeling a part of your savings to direct reparations. It's intervening and supporting someone being harassed by the police on your way to work, even if you're going to be late. I'll take this opportunity to plug the Black Lives Matter Toronto Legal Fund, which will support the 3 protesters mentioned in the opening remarks. The URL is available in our panel's resource doc, which will later be shared to everyone. Please consider donating right after this event if you're able. And if you're not based in Toronto or wish to contribute alternative resources, I ask you to dedicate the time to researching initiatives that you can contribute to in your specific context. There's also an open letter that will be circulating soon amongst artists and folks in the creative industry, advocating for the right to protest peacefully in creative ways. And that will be released soon in the next few days. We'll also share those or that in the document that will be shared. On that note, I haven't really heard anyone articulate the themes of this panel as well as Raven Wings has in the BLM Toronto press conference on Sunday. So as a first prompt for this panel discussion, we'll start with documentation of her speaking there. I'm going to screen share the video with sound, but the Vector team will also share the link with you in case we have any technical difficulties with screen sharing. Let me just click and
I just want to add something. We've tried many different ways to get the attention and the conversation of those in leadership roles and positions. Mm-hmm. It took us having to do this to get y'all to show up. We've been writing letters. Petitions. We've been creating books, photography, performance art. We've been doing it in every single way possible to let you know what we deserve, what we need. And you don't even have to dream it up. We've done the work for you. And so it's really ridiculous to me that we're still talking about monuments.
Outrageous. Yes.
It's really ridiculous to me that we have to fight for our dignity. You know, in the United States, there's a saying, life, liberty, and justice. Black people are still on life.
Yes. Yes.
We haven't gotten anything else. Right? And it's in the technology of blackness that we find abolition, and technology of black women, right? That we find radical love and intersectionality. The technology of black trans folks.
Yes. Yes.
In leadership roles. To make sure that you question. And this is not easy work. This is not fame work. We're destabilized. We're hyper-surveilled. We're followed. And just like this, we need to create a humanity where everyone and everything is allowed to exist, because we already do.
Yes.
See, white supremacy is creating a society, an ideal of a society, and using the state to enforce it.
Yes.
And this is what we're fighting against. Before y'all became white, you were something else. And we were something else. And we've had to fight in your delusion, your white supremacist delusion, for far too long. You're lucky that this is all we did. You're lucky that we're appealing to your humanity.
Yes. Yes.
You're lucky that we're not asking for vengeance
Yes. Yeah.
or revenge, because that's easy. But our love is radical. It's abolitionist. It's a future where each and everybody has what they need, what they deserve, what they want. It's raising a kid who's 4 years old, who's not afraid of the police. Just to remind you of why we're here.
And that's Raven Wings. That video is circulating on social media, albeit for free. I really recommend that folks visit her website and social media handles and seek a way to send her money for her work, because this is education work. And you know, as we can consume the histories and intelligence and insights of racialized folks, of poor, queer, disabled folks, folks who are ostracized and oppressed, know that it comes from their labor, and you're not making donations, you're paying them for their work. As Kim Ninkuru has said recently in her Instagram interview with Jessica Kiruhanga. And so I just want you folks to all keep that in mind. So we'll start with the questions now. In her address, Raven Wings refers to the technology of Blackness and Black trans folks in leadership roles. It's apparent that she's referring to systems of work that exceed typical industry standards or conventions. How do the notions of network, care, and solidarity take form in your work beyond traditional notions of new media, tech, social service, and healthcare industries?
Well, my work is largely guided by this idea of radical love and this idea of disability justice, right? And so disability justice grows out of BIPOC disabled communities. I'm a mad artist, I'm a Black disabled artist, and disability justice teaches us that we take care of each other, you know, that we are there for each other, that we build networks of support and care. There's this radical, beautiful idea of pod mapping that comes out of disability justice, where you map who the community is around you, who are your people, who are going to be there for you to take care of you if you need them in any moment of stress, in any moment of crisis. You know, and our folks like Rebel Stacey Black, Leah Lakshmi Piepsnia, Samara Sinha, and all of these amazing BIPOCs all across Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut have put all of this labor for the last 40 or 50 years into building a disability justice movement that is shaped around networks of care and networks of social justice and networks of liberation. And so for me, that's been really a guiding part of my work. So doing projects like activist love letters, where I get strangers to write love letters to activists in their communities. I've been doing that project for 8 years and have, you know, built up a whole, you know, now a network. I've sent thousands of letters around the world to activists all over, from people who don't know them, who are just saying, by the way, thank you. Thank you for your labor. Thank you for your activism. Thank you for what you're doing. And this is part of building up support and care around these activists. You know, I did an activist portrait series that was again aimed at trying to revere these people, admire these people, celebrate these people for their putting their lives on the line every day in order for us to get free. So networks of care are essential to my work. I believe that we will win this because we take care of each other, because we care for each other. So to me, it's essential to my practice.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for your work, Cyrus. Everyone on this panel has done so many incredible things in this topic. I would also love to think about care as it pertains to intergenerational storytelling. Like the more that we know about ourselves, the more that we get to tell the stories of the lives of our parents and our grandparents also allows for us to feel interconnected, to feel cared for, and also to feel as though we're carrying forward the people who have put their lives and their stability in variant levels of security for our safety moving forward. So a lot of the work that I do thinks about storytelling of the past and storytelling of the future to archive what has happened and write ourselves into a future. And that's an incredible amount of care because especially in technology, BIPOC individuals are not written into or like considered in the development of those futures. And so it's an enormous amount of care to bridge like our past and our futures to ensure our own knowledge of our existence as well for ourselves.
I find it incredibly important how you're emphasizing the importance of passing off to the next generation. I think the capitalist framework centers everything on ourselves, and then it becomes this great burdening responsibility, to, oh no, like, can I really do this? Can I make change? And I think that speaks to Cyrus's work with the love letters as well, passing off the letter, sending it off to a node that maybe you don't share the same physical space with, but nevertheless, there's kind of a space and geography of solidarity that's alternative to the spaces that capitalism and current infrastructures authorize.
Yeah, and I think about, sorry to just to pick up on that, just that this is what you're speaking to also is this beautiful, because we learn from the past. We don't just have to invent new ideas just for the future. We have traditions, we have ways of being, we have organizing. And so I think of that symbol, Sankofa, that comes from the Ashanti people in West Africa, that Adinkra symbol, Sankofa, of the bird going forward, but looking back at its tail, and this importance of being able to look forward, to move forward while remembering our past, and that it's so essential to remember our past in order to know where we're going in the future. And what you were saying just reminded me of that. So thank you for letting me share that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous right now, so I'm just kind of trying to collect my thoughts. But yeah, I want to thank you for how you started this conversation. And I'm also thinking about care and technologies, but also to be aware and conscientious of the micro gesture of care, the little things that we do every day. And I think that was very well highlighted in Belinda's introduction, just like reminding people to stay hydrated when, there's a heat wave. And these attention are contributing to our longevity and how we can keep on continuing to care for one another, because it's in that the resistance can be viable and survive, and that all generations can also work together. I don't remember where I picked that up, but it just stayed with me. It's a sentence I've heard from a TV show on Netflix. I don't know which one, but it was saying like, you need imagination to survive. And so I don't think we always need to reimagine, since we've always kind of been surviving, but we need that imagination to keep on surviving. And imagination, like memories, are also part of that imagination, nourishing it from generations to another generation. And hope is also part of that imagination.
I want to pick up on what you said about imagination and hope, because one thing that I have been interested in is what it means to negotiate and build in good faith. I think in a post-truth kind of narrative or world, there's this constant skepticism or doubt amongst others, and to think about, you know, what it means to dream together and imagine together in good faith, is something that is interesting to me, because it doesn't mean that you stop being critical, but you do start to build like slowly a relationship that has hope as the end goal, like as a good thing, a liberatory dream as the end goal to build out. And that has to be talked about in conversation with the more logistical things, the existing networks that we need to dismantle. Fallon, I'm really interested in your work with memes and generating this communication content, this rhetoric that's very digital as well as analog, and then like reconciling that work with your work in Indigenous jurisdiction. I think that really speaks to how the logistical interacts with the imaginative. I'm wondering if you could speak more to how within your own practice you've negotiated between those two worlds, the more imaginative and playful side, and then the more structured existing side of the law, the policy, and etc.
Definitely. Yeah, lots of things that all the panelists have said have really rang true for me and have sort of filled me with a sense of inspiration and also hopefulness. So thank you. I'm also very blessed and honored to be on a panel with all of you. It's always really great for me to be able to connect with other artists in a very meaningful way. So I really appreciate you all thinking of me and also just taking the time to be here with me right now. So thank you very much. So just sort of on the memes and the digital and the policy work, it's definitely very complicated, but I think one of the complicated, but in a sort of easy way with continued sort of perseverance and a sense of hopefulness and unity. But one of the best ways to sort of start that conversation for me is thinking about being able to sort of trace the different legislations and the different networks of care, like we mentioned before, and be able to continue to build around that and build within that. Yeah, so just to sort of branch that off of Indigenous jurisdiction work, the sort of Indian Act started a lot of Indigenous communities in Canada and moving them into like small reservation settlements. And then since those points and like those point in times, along with like residential schools, the 60s scoop, the millennial scoop, and like ongoing like decades of violence against Indigenous women, like all in between that time, Indigenous sort of community leaders of different kinds, whether they're like political or policy or connected to different anti-violence movements or environmental movements, they've all been able to sort of continue their care together and continue on this sort of journey of like land back and getting different organizations to sort of interact with their inherent jurisdiction, which I think for like an art context is a little bit difficult. And I don't actually totally, I know that in some instances like inherent Indigenous jurisdiction has been discussed with different artists, but I think it's definitely like sort of emerging sort of issue that I think is really, really important to sort of follow up on. But blending the policy and the political is definitely a tough one. Thank you.
I really admire, oh, sorry, Belinda.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I really admire the way you've bridged those two spaces, Fallon. A group of creative technologists and I have been running these sessions since the murder of George Floyd called Investing in Futures Beyond Policing. They're structured, imaginative spaces to actually co-create a society, a world without police structures, to unpin our own bias to our 2020 structure and think like what kinds of like co-care do we want to design for ourselves by ourselves. And those sessions have been really incredible, and we are like flooding our society, our little our groups with depictions of what a policeless society looks like, and hoping that they percolate into the corners where policy will be made. I just really love how your practice ties those two things together really tightly. I think imagination is like worthy of flooding and percolating, and it is also just really cool to see when people like actively put those two things together.
It's really amazing to see, you know, when I look at all of your work together, you know, I pull it up on multiple screens and look at their relations, how the arts has such rich sensory political material. You know, as a visual or sonic learner, it's difficult to sometimes engage with very dense political, legal subject matter. And, you know, to see that you folks are creating like sensory dimensions of possibility, I think is so incredibly important. And folks from these more official realms of policy and legal negotiating can learn from you all. And so thinking about the past weekend's events as a starting point for this conversation, you know, it's notable how the recoding of sculptural monuments gave rise to this unique conversation around the history, remembrance, and spatial sensory factors of justice and care work. I'm thinking about your thoughts about, I'm wondering your thoughts about monuments and what it means to deconstruct and reconstruct the idea of monument in your work, and perhaps how sustainable support structures might be understood as monuments of their own.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting looking at what happened over the weekend. These were three monuments that were, arguably grand symbols, celebrations of white supremacy, right? So these were monuments that were dedicated to the architect of the residential school system and also the apartheid system in South Africa. You know, these were monuments to somebody who in parliament, in his role as prime minister, said, I want to actively kill all indigenous people through starvation, right? These were monuments to a king who had colonized India, and that during the process of emancipation and decolonization, they had removed that statue, and the people had said, we don't want this in our communities. And it was inexplicably brought here through a private interest and put into one of our parks. These monuments are not monuments to anybody that should be celebrated. The attempted genocide of indigenous people all across Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut is deplorable. The people who say that they represent so-called Canada have done very little to actually be accountable to indigenous communities, right? And instead of being accountable, they are actually defending a monument to a brutal colonizer who attempted to eradicate an entire continent of beautiful, living human beings, right? We know that there were millions of Africans who were affected by the apartheid regime that was directly replicated from the residential school system. You know, we know what happened with British colonial rule in India. These are not things that we should be celebrating. I've been so moved by the way that activists and artists in the States have been thinking, okay, if we want to have a monument, who do we want to have a monument to? And as they take down the statues of General Lee and throw it in the Hudson River, they're replacing the statues with monuments to Black Lives Matter activists, you know, with sculptures that artists are creating monuments to the actual activists. I mean, if it were me, I would be creating 3 giant monuments to the 3 people who were arrested for peacefully protesting against racism. How are we arresting people for peacefully protesting against racism in 2020? My dad is from Memphis, Tennessee. He was around a teenager during Freedom Summer, and they were protesting against racism in 1963, and they were arrested, and they were detained, And the same thing happened in 2020. You know, we are still being arrested for fighting against racism. It's sort of in that strange way when people, you know, and Trump is sort of saying, oh, we have to be against Antifa. Antifa is terrible. Antifa just means anti-fascist. If you're not anti-fascist, what are you? If you're not anti-racist, what are you? If you're not protesting against racism in 2020, how are you, as Asada Shakur says, living with any human dignity on the planet at the moment if you're not involved in this struggle? So these monuments were considered more important than human life. These monuments were considered more important than a mad queer woman who was denied access to doctors and to medication and was driven around in a hot police car with no ventilation for hours and denied access to her legal counsel. A monument to the person who created the residential school system that has resulted in generations of intergenerational trauma and that has brutalized millions of Indigenous people across Turtle Island and Nunavut. That person, that statue, the same statue that is dyed purple, that is stickered, that is emblazoned with paint by engineering students at Ryerson every single fall and nothing happens, that statue was considered more important than the Black queer woman who they held and detained and denied access to the medication and the support that she needed. This is what is so bizarre. Monuments are supposed to be remnants and remembering of what has happened in our world. And when we want to think about the kind of so-called Canada that we like to say that we are, I don't think these monuments represent who we are becoming, who we want to be. Everybody is talking about the kind of world they want to emerge from after COVID. Everybody is saying, what is this community that we want to be part of after this pandemic is done? And I know that the world is saying we do not want to emerge into another white supremacist society. We do not want to emerge into another capitalist society. We do not want to emerge into a society that still has police and prisons brutalizing our communities, killing Indigenous mad people, killing Black mad people. So these monuments are right now symbols of racism, of violence, and they need to be taken down. And artists are creative and they're coming up with beautiful new monuments, testaments to people in the struggle, testaments to the people that we actually should be revering, the people that we love, the people who are fighting to make sure that everybody has self-determination, that everybody has freedom, and then we all get to live our full lives. We get to be old enough to live to become elders.
Thank you for that, Cyrus.
Yeah, I mean, obviously to echo everything Cyrus is saying and to add that, like, to consider the daily lived experience of Indigenous person who walks down Ryerson's campus each day, accessing a power, accessing education, and looking up to see this monument to this extraordinary oppressor, I really don't, it feels so clear cut to me as a person of color, why that like continued representation and that continued identification of oppression needs to be removed. And I think that these are the funny things about Canada and its intention in words to describe a future that they want, that's inclusive, that's empowering, and then in practice to have these repetitious reminders of hierarchy, repetitious reminders of genocide, repetitious reminders of colonization. They are unaligned by intention, and in this triple pandemic, people have had enough.
As you folks are sharing, you know, I'm thinking about my own work as my own problems as a curator and like thinking about this vast gap between lived experience and material culture / property in artistic practice. You know, how material culture by arts industries, white supremacist art industries often detach the artwork from the lived experience and histories that are actually tied and inherent to the material aesthetics that are there. I'm just, you know, it's such an open-ended question, but I'd like to hear your folks' thoughts on that kind of dynamic and how, like, maybe what kind of strategies you have employed or are employing to rehumanize material culture. Because in fact, it's a huge problem when folks look at documentation and they don't know how to connect it to lived experience. Geneviève, I'm particularly interested in your practice as a curator. You know, there's so much thematic and theoretical content on the root word of curating being of care, you know, but in practice, you know, what does that look like? I'm thinking, you know, sorry to take up too much space, but I'm thinking lots about Deanna Bowen's work at Art Museum of Toronto with the play God of Gods, and how Maya Sanchez Wilson had a conversation with her about it. And particularly, you know, they brought up this really important point that care also is biopolitical in the fact that it nurtures violence. You know, so how do we specify like care as liberatory work and distinguish it from how care is weaponized violently in art domains and beyond that? So yeah, just to share that as a starting point, but I'm really interested to hear your take on curatorial practice and how to employ those radical ideas of networking and caring as opposed to the capitalist and racial ones.
Like, okay. Oh my God, you made so many good points and like so many connections. I think I'm just gonna depart from myself and maybe the things that I've been thinking through lately. And hopefully I will be able to thread it back to some of the concept that you've put forward and some of your questioning. I think in my curatorial practice, when I'm thinking about care, it's sometimes literal, but sometimes it's also in the story that I want to co-create with the artist. And so to go to a direction that not necessarily include trauma, not because it's not valid, not because these spaces are not needed, but because I am noticing a uncomfortable institutional hunger for trauma-based narratives. And it is dangerous in a sense that it's asking over and over again to many different communities to re-traumatize themselves publicly before having the right or the space to heal. And it's just deeply troubling for me. So and I think that, let's say, one of my strategy is to try to infuse maybe more contemplative notions as a point of departure, to talk about any important and urgent politics. But to also, like, you know, we have and deserve and need to have the right for pleasure and joy, and to go see an exhibition that prompts questions about our interiority and who we can be and the vastness of ourselves. And so I think that in that vein, then material culture is everything, because this is where we find ourselves and find solace. But we can also choose what kind of material culture we want to share as well. We don't have to share everything. And then we also kind of we're able to also determine what kind of narratives we want to put out there through this material culture, because in some ways it will always be somewhat obscured to the white gaze because it's from our own. not sure how to continue this tangent. But yeah.
No, thank you. And I've had the pleasure of, interacting with you as co-curators. And I have to say, it's like being a curator is beyond the projects you put out. It's how you talk to people. It's how you ask about their day. That unspoken kind of dynamic. You have definitely shown that in my interactions with you. And I think that is something that's not marketed, but it's witnessed by folks who know you.
Thank you so much for recognizing that. I think there is an invisible labor in curatorial practice that is not spoken about that much. But I'm always trying to, I'm doing my best always. And I think for me, transparency and integrity is something that I put, forward in my relationships. And I always want those relationships to be sustainable as much as possible. But I do know that, in certain instances, I might not have been as transparent, as integral as I want to, but I keep on learning of being accountable with myself and the people I work with. And that's also where care comes from. And when I work with artists, I always try to be like, if there's something, let's try to iron it out and talk and try to have the difficult conversations. Because at the end of the day, when we are all collaborating together, we don't know each other that much. We're learning to get to know each other through that collaboration. We don't necessarily know what prior institutional trauma happened before they get to work with you, or just where they're coming from, how their day was, how the last year was. And therefore, I think trust building takes a lot of vulnerability and showing up when you're wrong, showing up, and never to be over confident in knowing and thinking that you've read someone. Yeah.
I really like what you said about the reaction to this social justice movement as it stands right now from the institutions. I wholeheartedly agree that it seems to be an institutional reaction of hunger and greed for suffering and trauma, which is not what we're asking for as a marginalized population. We're not asking to have to tell our story as it stands in the trauma that's over and over and over again. I think that positionality is to serve the hunger of the white gaze and really doesn't allow for us to have a conversation with each other. And I think that is extractive just as much as it is extractive in the same kind of emotionally laborious way for people to have to engage with these conversations over and over again on deaf ears. And so I wholeheartedly agree with you that the space that I think we want as an a group of artists, as a population of artists, is also to have monuments and artworks and exhibitions that are in conversation with the multiplicity of existences that is beyond exclusively trauma narratives. It's quite the cap on imagination to just have to be obliged to talk about trauma. It's important, but also thinking about who is it for? Who is that narrative for? I know about the trauma of my history. I don't need exclusive stories in that regard. Who is that narrative for?
And there's this incredible work that comes out of Boise UT by Dr. Eve Tuck, who's an Indigenous scholar and writer. And she writes about this idea of damage-based research versus desire-based research, and how for racialized and marginalized communities, we are written about and thought about and processed through as always already damaged, as always already what happened to us, as always already, you know, just as you've described, you know, this trauma narrative is what we're asked to contribute without ever being able to tell the desire-based part, which is that we are beautiful and vast and complex, that we have many, many, many things that have happened in our lives, that we get to bring our whole selves, that Blackness, that indigeneity, that disability, that being poor, all of these things are things that have joy and beauty attached to them as well, in the ways that we build community, in the ways that we're there for each other, in the ways that we take care of each other, and that coming at it from a desire-based approach totally changes it. So there's a beautiful, I think it's called An Open Letter on Damage-Based Research. I can't remember, but Eve Tuck, and a really great theorizing there.
Yeah,
Cyrus, you showed me that text, and I thank you so much for it, because it's really influenced my work. Sorry, go ahead, Fallon.
Sorry. I think she calls it like the pulse, the bruise on our pulse points or something similar like that. I remember like reading it also. Very, very good text. But yeah, just on like trauma and like material culture and sort of the consumption of that. I think like just digging back in history, like a little, not too far, but like, and also trigger warning. But when Sandra Bland was murdered, like there was so much calls for this idea of proof, and this idea of like, I need to continually consume this until I will believe that this murder was real. And it was just such a revelation of how people do really sometimes, especially white supremacist culture, will desire to consume those kinds of details. And as like artists are that kind of trauma, they want to consume that kind of trauma and that kind of that pain. So as artists and curators and designers and culture workers, like putting those boundaries on sort of the items and culture and materials that we put out into the world is also really important, and also I think is a part of our liberation and connections into a future. On because I was given very like intense warning about over consuming, but also like not consuming, but like in the sense that like I just something that came up and then it still continues to come up. And yeah, I'm not sure how to word it, but just that it still affects me when I think about it, and I like get pretty emotional, and I feel like I get like an embodied sort of trauma sort of response to when I think about people sharing that kind of stuff, and the kind of like person on the other side of the screen who would be watching that. And it just like scares me so much, because like conversely, just having my own experiences as like an Indigenous person, and following the lives of like posts about young people who have committed suicide, or like reading the headlines of Indigenous women who have gone missing, sometimes as like an artist, my brain just like really reacts very quickly and strongly and visually in my head. And like I can just sometimes like see and also feel these things as they sort of happen. So just like on the material culture component of like sharing and like designing futures, but also like having like steadfast boundaries about or like firm boundaries around what we share, I think is like super important as we sort of go into the future all collectively. Thank you for listening to me.
Yeah, the desensitization to these images and to these like stories is real. I think about that all the time as well, and why we need so much proof that things have happened, and who needs the proof, and then who's like inadvertently affected. Like the repetitious exposure to those images is like it begins to feel dehumanizing after a while as well.
And I think about, I'm 43. And so, I remember in the 90s, I can remember being in high school and there was these whispers about there was such a thing as a snuff film, and is it real? And this was before the internet, so you couldn't look it up to see if it was real. But people said there was such a thing as a snuff film, which is where somebody is killed on camera. And it was, would you ever watch one? Well, in 2020, snuff films are on the internet every day. Every day. And in the case of George Floyd, even though I suppose the camera video evidence was very damning for the police officer who knelt on his neck and murdered him, trigger warning. Sorry for not saying that first, but that video I didn't watch that video. I'm not watching a snuff video of Black people being killed. I'm not doing that. I will not do that to myself, to my spirit, to my ancestors, to all of my relations that I'm connected to. It is too traumatic. I would not do that. But we allow, these snuff videos to sort of circulate because white supremacy requires that the most damning evidence just to possibly believe that white supremacy exists. And even in the most damning evidence, as in that video of George Floyd, which was 9 minutes or something, they're still like, well, but was it racism? You know what I mean? So it doesn't matter. So putting it out there isn't actually solving the denial, but it is fueling, as you say, this hunger for watching us extinguished. For all the people who are sharing it to try to prove that this is real, that racism is real, there are other people sharing it because they genuinely enjoy watching our demise, right? So we have to realize that. So I'm very conscious of the way I think of that. You remember Jane's Addiction? I was a punk rocker and a goth in the 90s, but there was this Canadian, were they Canadian? Anyways, there was this band, Jane's Addiction. They ended up starting Lollapalooza and everything. But they had this song called Nothing Shocking. And they wrote it in 89 or something, just about what happens when you flood the media with violent images. When you flood the media with violent images and how it desensitizes people and it creates a world where nothing is shocking anymore. We should have been so shocked and so horrified by watching any of the things that we've watched. Trayvon, George Zimmerman on all of his comments, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, I could go on and on and on. All of these things, and so many of them with video evidence. We should have been so shocked that we should have all risen up with everything that we had to say never again. And it should have been made sure that it never happened again after the very first time. So the evidence is not actually creating that rising up. We need something else. The videos and the snuff films are not keeping us necessarily safer or more secure. And they're also fueling the narrative that we need to continually increase police budgets by putting body cameras on them, right? It continues this narrative that if we just have it on video, we are going to be safer, right? And what we know is that the body cameras don't work. A body camera was on and videotaped them killing George Floyd. In the case of Regis Christiansky-Paquette, did they turn the cameras off? Were the cameras on? The cameras are not reliable, right? And they're also a way of increasing police budgets. So when Trudeau says, yes, there's a problem with policing, we need to address their accountability, we're going to put police body cameras, what he's doing is he's going exactly against what the majority of constituents are saying. They're saying defund, and what he's saying is increase. So the body cameras end up then increasing the police budget. So this narrative of needing the snuff film to sort of prove that Black life is valuable, that we are innocent, that white supremacy is doing these killings, is actually fueling the prison system and the policing system by then, requiring the need for these expensive body cameras, which don't come out of the existing budget, which are always an additional set of money that gets put there. And also, I just think, at this point in society, if we're at the place where the people that we pay billions of dollars a year to supposedly keep us safe, if the only way that they can keep us safe is that they have a camera on them all the time so that we can capture them beating the shit out of us, if that's the only thing that's going to stop them from beating the shit out of us, from disappearing us, from driving us around in the middle of the night, from doing the Starlight tours and all of that, if that's the only thing that's going to keep them from brutalizing us, you have to wonder why we're paying these people. Would anybody else be allowed to do this in their job? If I was doing my job at the AGO and I was doing it so terribly that they needed to put a body camera on me to make sure that I wasn't doing something horrific, I would have been fired. I would have been fired. So this is ridiculous.
It also makes me wonder about consent over time. Like, I think about Breonna Taylor, especially, who has been memorialized in so many different social media imagery and illustrations. And in some way, there's this like declaration, like say her name. But in the other way, I think like, you know, what is there not also like a stripping of the dignity by like repetitiously like sharing this individual's name without that individual's consent? Like Breonna Taylor never got an opportunity to consent to having her imagery like in the billions recreated and redistributed for a multiplicity of intentions. And it also makes me worried about how we are slowly shifting our relationship to digital consent as well.
I just want to flag that we are now at 4 p.m. Thank you so much, you all, for sharing such vulnerable and powerful material. It's, yeah, I'm thankful that you folks, you know, are willing to impart these insights and, you know, these kinds of things when talked about, when there's lived experience attached to them, you know, I feel it in my body, and I know you folks feel it in your bodies too. And so thank you. I just want to, I guess, end this panel discussion. You know, the discussion never ends. With you know, something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of your works and practices, and also in the racialized and oppressed artists that I work with. And that is this conversation about how nonfiction claims to document the truth, but fiction and magic realism and imagination makes us feel the truth. And this has been like an insight, you know, that I've gathered over time. Like, no one has said this directly, but through working with racialized mad crip artists, M. Nurbeze Phillip has done a lot for me in like making me realize how much, you know, the artistic and the poetic doesn't need to outline documentation in the way that capitalist and violent legal structures require us to. It's about knowing that there's a community of lived experience and trusting that lived experience to fill in the gaps of artistic expression and communication, and to build from there rather than rehashing traumas over and over again. It's about like trusting in each other as creators and co-imaginers. And so I want to end by asking you folks, you know, about how your artistic practice, if you were to name like 2 to 3 takeaways, how your artistic practice has changed the way that you feel about or think about or think through political and legal structures that are inherently violent. Just to leave a message to the folks that are in our audience today about how they might think about current events differently.
Could you just say the last part again?
How artistic and poetic practices have changed the way you think through inherently violent political and legal structures, is the question I'm asking. And if there are like maybe 2 to 3 takeaways that you can share about that. It's a very general question. If it's too general, feel free to not answer it.
I mean, I've been involved in a lot of art-based activism. I mean, my art practice is an activist-based practice. My activist practice is an arts-based practice, and I've seen the power of using creativity to share a message, and what, you know, just how you know, not everyone is going to read a PhD dissertation about the fungibility of Black bodies on Indigenous land, which is a beautiful and brilliant dissertation by Dr. Tiffany King, and it's amazing, but some people are not learners in that way. And so we have to get the information in different ways. You can have incredibly difficult and complex conversations about, a very deep set of knowledges through an artistic way that can reach way more people than just relying on people being able to read academic text or to read a whole book or whatever. So the arts are such an accessible way to have very complicated conversations. And so watching, folks do some of the art interventions all across Turtle Island and Inuit Nunavut has been incredible. I mean, there are so many paintings supporting Black lives, supporting defunding the police, monuments being erected, spray paint everywhere, streets being renamed. There is so much artistic intervention that you can literally see it from space right now. I saw a statue of General Lee that was being taken down, surrounded by art and messages that was so vast. It was an actual photograph from space. So this movement is so visible that literally the universe is watching it. It is not just people in Canada. It is not just people in the United States or colleagues in Europe or Australia or the continent. It is literally visible from space. So this is a creative movement, and creativity and artists' involvement is so essential to doing this work because they help to translate the information in an accessible format. And artists have always been the ones who have helped us to take that imaginative leap into the future, to say, what is it that we're working to create? How do we get there? And they're literally helping us to paint a picture or to tell a story or to envision a potential future where we actually have won, where we are free, where our children are free, where we've eradicated the violence of the prison industrial complex and the policing system. Octavia Butler did it. She told us stories after story after story about what the future could potentially look like, not only in a hopeful way, but also in a way that would caution us and warn us. When she wrote Parable of the Sower in 1993 or 1992, she predicted a world that is today, that is so accurate that the right-wing president in that story had the same campaign slogan as Donald Trump, "Make America Great Again." Right? So she was able to predict a future through her creativity that helped us to better plan and better prepare for this moment. So artistic interventions are so essential in doing this work and doing the network of care, in building a knowledge base that we can all collectively share so that we all have the information to be able to think and decide and act how we want to get involved in this movement. The last thing I would just say is that this is a time for now. This is the time for everybody to get involved. If you've ever been wondering what you would have done in 1963 or 1964 during Freedom Summer, or if you would have stood with the Black Panthers in 1969, or if you would have picked up a brick with Marsha P. Johnson and thrown it through the window at the police who were brutalizing the trans women who were being arrested at the Stonewall Inn, and if you were wondering what you would have done, if you would have run with Two-Spirit activist Billy Morasti up the steps of the legislature during the protests after the bathhouse raids, if you've wondered what you would do in moments of extreme uprising against injustice, now is the time to show up. Now is the time to test yourself and see how you can get involved and see how you can support the people whose lives are on the front lines. And if you're an artist, how can your practice help support the liberation of all people? Because right now, literally the lives of every living being on this planet depends on it. The white supremacist system that we're in is destroying the planet. It is going to guarantee that all life will be eradicated because of climate change. It is going to guarantee that Black people will continue to be murdered in the street by the police with little impunity. It will guarantee that Indigenous people will continue to be marginalized and disenfranchised. That is what white supremacy does. It is literally destroying all life on this planet. When we say all Black lives matter, what we're saying is what the Combahee River Collective said in 1973. If you make the world safer for the people who are the most marginalized, you are necessarily making the world safer for everyone. So when we say all Black lives matter, what we're saying is that then necessarily everyone's life would matter. Everyone would get to be free. Everyone would have what they need, not just to survive, but to thrive. And so that's where artists are involved in this movement. Artists are involved in pushing against this. Now is the time to get involved. Now is the time to act. There's no better time to fight against racism than maybe yesterday. But I mean, if not, then definitely do it today.
it's a hard speech to follow. I would just add that, like, the reason why we're even sitting here in any margin of freedom at all is due to the collective imagining of our ancestors and the ability for people in lives that came before us to come together to envision and act upon something they'd yet unseen. They had not been able to witness with their own eyes. And Martin Luther King and his I Have a Dream speech outlines an enormous amount of things that he had never seen, that he was only hoping were possible in the future. And I think that the idea of what we're engaging with right now cannot be limited by what we think is possible logistically. And I think that that is really important to consider, that the capabilities of which we could exist in an equitable and equal way may not be seen at this moment. And that doesn't mean that we don't pursue them based on ideas, imaginings, and envisionings of artists and creatives. I would also say that, you know, the engagement from a political standpoint and from like a constitutional standpoint in terms of policy and lawmaking is not necessarily one of co-creation. So we know who has power in that space and how few BIPOC individuals are able to be at the table in those meetings, co-creating or world building from that perspective. But an artistic approach is a community approach. It's a co-creation of people in all different nooks and crannies of your city, in all different nooks and crannies of your country, potentially via Zoom this way. So an artistic approach to this is also a collective co-imagining in a way that's far more dynamic and far more visionary than a non-creative approach could possibly be, just by the sheer nature of access and who is at the table.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Cyrus, for all that you have been saying as takeaways. Harder now to follow. I think I will stick to maybe more discourse around maybe like exhibition making and museum setting. I came into curation not knowing it was a job for the longest time. And I think at first it was about, I wanted to work in a big, museum such as Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal or, the AGO, something like that. And thinking that putting my body in there, as a disruption is what was needed to be done. And I think through working and navigating those institutions, I think I shifted in terms of what it even means to be a Black woman curator, what it means to enter those spaces, what kind of spaces I want to create when I'm inviting in and inviting other artists to work in those spaces or to be in the art world. And what I hope for, and sometimes, unfortunately, not being able to do, is to be able to work as maybe a protective buffer to make sure that creative experimental expressions of those imaginings are, presented in a safer manner, that the experience is less traumatizing, that the experience feels like can be or has the potential to be, if it was not in the occurrence of working with me, but still having a glimpse that it has the potential to be soft and to be tender and to be caring. And that's what I hope for. That's what I wish to accomplish whenever I work with someone. And sometimes, there's certain situations that cannot be provided for that, but this is what I want to do as a curator. And also, I also like to think about invisible structure, like the invisible glue that are sustaining us and still is sustaining people in the past, and to dig up those nuggets of where we see lack, that there was also abundance of something else, something that was still nourishing us. Because although we are fighting for our own life, we are still nourished in so many other ways. And I think this, like, art is a space to also explore and acknowledge that, acknowledge the tenderness and the smiles, the hugs, the just the little moments that are enlightening our lives, because not all is darkness and we are light. And yeah.
Thank you all for sharing. I really appreciate it, and also thank you for listening. So some of the things that I like to think about is how I like bring together different pieces of information from different areas. So when I think about like building on the earlier question about bringing in policy into art making, or bringing in policy language or understanding into art making, and then also bringing art making into my policy sort of work. I think just like one of the only questions that I have is just really short. It's just, and this is sort of inspired by the National Inquiry Calls for Justice report called, I think it's called Power and Place. And essentially the main like bit of information that the report noted was some of the root causes of violence against Indigenous women was that much of all of the lives of the women had been shaped by these encounters with different systems, and how some of their lives are essentially defined by those encounters. So like Cyrus was saying, prisons or police or child welfare, but also even women's shelter services. So those systems kind of define their moments and their lives where they could have received or had access to essential services, and then didn't receive those services, and then that ultimately ended in their murder or disappearance. Some of the major issues around policymaking is looking for definitions of things. Just to sort of leave you with that policy sort of access point is many times there will be like policymakers or politicians will be like, but what does that mean? And it's just kind of like gaslighting, making you second guess yourself, like you don't know what you're talking about, but what they're asking for is just sort of like a definition. So for me, one of the things that I would think of is how we make a new definition of our lives and what that looks like in the future. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for giving us your insight. And to the audience, please take a look at all of our panelists' work and continue to support them. I think what they do really speaks to how cultural self-determination can be context specific, but also build interdependent solidarity at the same time. There's so many like love languages for connecting folks in care and solidarity. And when there's something that you don't understand, there's always another language out there to which you can be connected to the bigger picture. And thank you all so much for, so eloquently showing that to us through the things that you folks talk about. And I also want to say, like as much as panels are rousing and etc., if you feel great about this panel, channel that appreciation for the panel through direct means as well as self-reflection. Look around you and see who, like to the audience, especially non-Black and Indigenous folks who have power, like please look around you and see who needs support rather than looking at a panel and reaching out to someone across the country or not within your specific context, because we all have a role to play where we are. And so I just want to leave you folks with that. We have a few questions, very few, just one or two. So there's one from Leslie, and it's directed to, I believe it's directed to you, Fallon. So I wonder how you feel about using memes to promote political activism. Any thoughts on the Manny, which was popularized on TikTok?
I'm not sure what the Manny is.
Me neither. Sorry, I don't know if I can give context to that, but let me take a look at what that is, or if the person can clarify in the questions.
But overall, like memes as a political policy making tool, I think it's like super useful. Like I know that sometimes maybe people have different definitions of what a meme is, and in the same way that people have different definitions of like what art generally is. But there's just, I really think memes at the end of the day are just small bits of information that get shared widely with people. So it's just, and all it is meant to be is just meant to be something that's accessible, that people can read, and is just something that can stop somebody in a moment and they sort of understand, or they get a sense of connection to the content of what people are trying to say. But yeah, I think that's about all that I would think a meme is. And I think also they've had a lot of significance when it comes to the What's in folks and Standing Rock, and I think as well have had a lot of yeah, I think that's sort of where I'll leave that one. Hopefully that helps.
I've been making, because of COVID and because of the world, I normally draw very large drawings, 20 feet high, 12 feet high. I mean, I work really large scale normally and drawing, graphite and paper, but because of COVID and because of I'm immunocompromised, I have to sort of stay in. I've been doing a lot of memes and creating posters. And there was this strange incident of these white art collectors who drew their weapons on Black Lives Matter protesters who were going by their house. Do you remember this? There were this white couple, they were lawyers, and they took their armed weapons, and one was like an AK-47 and one was a handgun, and she had her finger on the trigger and she pointed it at Black Lives Matter protesters as they walked by. So it's just sort of this strange story of white supremacy. But then you find out that they're art collectors, and then you find out that they own this Van Dyke, and then you find out that they donate to all of these museums. And then you realize, oh, this is actually an art issue. This is, so I started making memes about those art collectors to try to draw attention to the fact that this is an art issue, that all art galleries and museums and artist-run centers and artists should be talking about what happened, because these are the people who are funding our institutions, are drawing automatic weapons, semi-automatic weapons on protesters. It is absolutely bizarre. So I made memes, and I'll tell you something, the racist trolls, they didn't like those memes. They did not like them. They did not like them. They did not like, I wrote Black Lives Matter over the Van Dyke painting. And it's a simple meme. And I guess it got the point across because they did not like it. They did not like it.
You're making me think, when we were talking about monuments, wings, specific like wings in museums and specific dedication to like generous patron are also to be questioned. Who are these people? What are their values? And should they be there? Like we know, that also museums are upholding, visually, at least white supremacy like system. But I think in thinking of that, there's also like the monuments within the museums to also reconsider.
Yeah, a capitalist colonial system takes money from anybody, but should we be taking money from anybody? Probably not.
Yeah, and it's so strange because often the, who's who in terms of who's making the donations, who's giving the funds for the acquisition of the work, never Black and Indigenous work, but who's giving the funds for the acquisition of new works, like who's doing the funding of these institutions is often actually not something that is very public, or that people have to really dig to find that information out. And I think that we need to start asking bigger questions about exactly where this money is coming from. When you look at the history of museums and galleries that are legacy institutions that started in 1901 or started in 1945 or whatever, a lot of that money, that donors, it's not clean money. This is coming through the slave trade. This is coming through other systems that anyone who was really rich in 1901 who was white, I'm not really sure where that money came from, but we got to ask a lot more questions. Anyone who was really rich who was white after the war, you got to ask a lot of questions about where that money came from in 1945. So I think that we need to start asking more questions of these institutions, and we need to, these named halls and these named buildings, who are these people who are supposedly representing us and supposedly creating this free space for us to have a forum and public dialogue? What are they actually supporting and funding behind the scenes?
And how do those values trickle through the entire system down into the atmosphere and the intentions of that show, right? There is always going to be some connected line between the core values of like who is initiating through funds an experience and who gets to experience it. Like there's always going to be a through line. And I think that this is a really important, not that this is a scarce time for examples of how to be an ally. Lots of really great examples out there of how to be an ally right now. But this is a really good opportunity for allyship, to be asking those questions, to be figuring out how to unpin institutions from these kinds of core values on a deep level. That's a really important question that I would like to continue to ask as an artist, but I would also like to expect from my allies who are aiding my work to be exposed. It's a very important time for those kinds of endeavors and those kinds of like true collaborations in justice.
Thank you so much, folks. It is approaching 4:30, and so this pretty much concludes our panel, but not the discussion on these matters. The endeavors continue, and I love ending on this notion of memes and museums. How scalable and multidimensional this kind of work is. Before meeting up and doing this panel live, we talked about how multiscalar this work is, and the existence of multiple consciousness, or the requirement of multiple consciousnesses to navigate through this. And racial, what really speaks to me and all that you folks have shared is the fact that oppressed folks in the arts are working with multiple consciousnesses, and this multiplicity is what we are often dealing with in poetics and aesthetics. We have to look at things from a structural level. We have to look at things from a decentralized level. We have to look at things big and small in space and time. And so I think it's so incredibly important to keep that in mind and not to limit this discussion to very clean definitions, as Fallon said, of what matters. So yeah, I think we'll continue this conversation by releasing the resources doc, and feel free to contact the Vector Festival team for pointers to the references that were mentioned throughout the panel. And again, thank you folks for your time.
I just want to thank everyone. It was such a pleasure to be on this panel with you all and to share all of these nuggets of knowledge and bubbly thoughts. And you're all wonderful. And thank you. Like Belinda, you're so smart and you've brought us together, and all of the prompts of conversations we've had before this panel were exquisite. And thank you for your work and for your care and all of this process. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to all of you. It's such an honor to get to share space with you and to get to share ideas.
Such an honor.
And to talk. And I know Belinda, you and I have been doing some abolition stuff together for quite a few years now. Now it's been at least probably 5 years since we did that course together. And, you know, this movement around abolition and defund is being driven by artists. And I thank you for your care and guidance, and also for just reminding us in this discussion how we come back to this idea of network and community and care and collective care, and just reminding us that that is essential for our survival. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Belinda. It's been a real honor to be able to share the space together, and to be able to share the opportunity to walk away feeling rejuvenated. And I just really appreciate all the artists on this panel and what they contributed to that residual feeling.
It's all very mutual. It's all very mutual. All right, audience, thanks for joining us. I think I'll end it here. If the Vector team, who has also been incredibly supportive, has nothing else to add, I'm going to be signing off. Take care, everyone.